test. All right, it looks like we've got several people on board, so we're going to go ahead and start on time. My name's Rich Ham. You can see me. I'm going to show you at least my photo for a little bit and then save some of the broadband. In a moment, we begin the presentation. I'll set a couple of rules first, and that is we've got the chat box open. You can send a chat. I'll either ask it during the presentation as a normal scope of the things that I know we're covering, or when we get to the end, I'll make sure I cover something if we didn't talk about it during the presentation. That's me. You'll see, as typical, my professional photo looks better than I do otherwise, but nonetheless, kind of the background on who I am and kind of why this subject in particular, I think, is near and dear to my heart because I've done it. The idea and the title being the Homeland Security Operations Manager, and why most people don't understand, but I hope by the end of today you will, that you are one, whether you know it or not, if you're in operations management. I want to ask a couple of questions. We will, the typical questions everybody would ask. One that we get asked often is the course in operations management. How does it apply? We went through and actually did a needs assessment. We discovered several of our students had a great interest in Homeland Security in the application, but the piece that often is missing is the understanding of how important it is to operations management and business operations in general. Since September 11th in particular, there's been a great increase in the requirements of what it is that you've got to do and what kind of things you must comply with, and even beyond that, what to do just to be a good citizen, maintain the safety of your personnel, but then also what happens if you have an incident occur. Some of that we'll speak to is what in fact you have or what you get out of maintaining a Homeland Security awareness and having the situational awareness. So hopefully by the end of the day, what we'll answer is, who does it affect? What is included in operations management or Homeland Security and operations management? When am I required to comply? And that I meaning you as an individual, you as a manager, you as a C-suite decision maker, just the whole gambit of people that would be within the scope. Where are the threats? Both national security and business intelligence. What is it that we need to look at and understand? And then how does it affect me? You know, one of the things I find interesting, and especially with students and in some consulting, is people will look and say, wait a minute, I'm responsible for what? And they really don't understand how deep the compliance requirements are and what it means to them. So let's jump right in and talk about all the things that are required. First off, let me start by saying when we talk about who, you could just get to the very end, the bottom line up front, if you will, and say everyone. There really is virtually no one today in government or industry that's not touched at all by Homeland Security requirements. And I want to split a couple of things up too for an operations manager, and from that perspective, you know, we're talking a lot about effectiveness, which we would define as your ability to comply. How effective are you in doing the things that you're required to do? But then efficiency, and often that's the piece that most leaders are wanting to know. They know they're required, and they know they have a risk associated, whether that risk means they have an increased chance of loss, or if it means the government could fine them or even shut their business down. Whatever that is, the idea that I need to be effective in complying, but at the same time efficient. You can be very effective in complying, but yet not do a very good job. We talk a little bit about that in the class that we have here, and we'll touch on a few of those today. So let's look. So travelers, obviously, if you travel or your employees travel, the use of pre-check and global entry, and then other than those two are, so that's something that affects you. It actually affects travel planning. And so if you have if you're an operations manager, say of the travel department at a large company, then understanding what that does for you, the difference that it makes on the tickets prices or how you purchase them, or timing, or how you do transfer of say of flights, or how you plan in general for meetings, makes a big difference. Customs and the restrictions of those. So those are not just what we would think at as overseas for ICAO or TSA in the United States, but what you're restricted from doing. Now you see there's a whole different planning cycle about even for salespersons that are going out, because they used to be able to carry through the checkpoint with them samples that they can't anymore. Certain types of liquids, chemicals, others, those are prohibited. You can't take them. And then customs have changed significantly coming back into the United States. The types of things that you can bring and can't. One of the things that's gotten great attention traveling overseas, and there's not many that are cash businesses anymore, but it's against the law, and it's looked at, has paid high attention to. If you try to travel outside of the country and do it carrying more than $10,000 in US dollars, or in instruments that are easily converted quickly. That is, although it's been there for some time, it's really an anti-terrorism issue. Not many have that problem, but a few businesses operate on a cash operation. So now you have to rethink, how do you get products and cash, especially when you go overseas. Manufacturers have a new set of export controls that they have to pay attention to. There's certain things, sensors and the like, that you cannot send overseas, and there's some that have to be contained even domestically on who in fact you allow now to have access to, which can trigger the requirement for background checks that weren't there before. In the supply chain, we'll talk more in some of the other sections, but everything from how you integrate the security requirements, which internationally or by air, even domestically, have greatly increased, but even some of the local cases, depending on whether or not you have chemicals that are now regulated and require you to rethink about your supply chain and how you move them. Some of those things you can't move anymore without either a permit or following a very specific plan that you've submitted that's been approved. I put schools under manufacturers, but it could almost stand on its own, because there's several in these categories that we would speak to. But also, manufacturers and industry often will train people to do things. I mean, sometimes they have internships, or others, depending on what it is that they do, they may have a requirement. They might get tied into something we'll talk in a moment more about, the types of programs that you have to comply with. Shippers in general, not just a manufacturer looking at their own supply chain, but how a shipper looks at their requirements to ensure that they've followed either a security program required by law, and how they integrate that into their program and gain efficiency. Much of the efficiency that can be gained is about trying to take different lines of business and put them together. For many years, often what would happen is each line of business is done separately, and so if you're required to look for hazardous material by one regulation, but then also look for, say, bombs or contraband in another one, each one of those would pull it out and do a separate either search or screening or x-ray or whatever they're required to do, or certification. But the efficiency part, you can be very effective at doing all those, but you can be much more efficient if you establish the layout in your manufacturing facility, or if you establish the way where your location is, so that you're close to other third parties that are authorized to do that work for you. Obviously, C-suite decision makers sometimes the security requirements are enough to make a decision that that business, that the company won't engage in that business. The bottom line is there's pretty much no one that hasn't been affected, and in operations management, it's even wider than it is for the general public. One of the big ones that we see when we talk about shipping, especially for those that are either shipping by air or by ports, or if you're receiving goods, is CTPAT, Customs Trade Partnership against terrorism. That program, as an example, I would give you a great example. Last year we had in the Distinguished Speaker series, when the Governor Hutchinson came and spoke, he spoke about how after he had left the Department of Homeland Security, he represented a few companies, and their entire part of not just effectiveness, complying with which requires a certification, but their efficiency. It's the difference at the border, either in Mexico or coming across to Canada, of going to the CTPAT expedited line and getting into the country in 10 or 15 minutes, or sometimes spending 2 or 3 hours. So you can imagine, depending on, especially if you have perishable goods, that besides the effectiveness, it's also an efficiency issue so that you can get back into the country. For air shipments, there's 2 primary programs. The Certified Cargo Security Program, which allows a certified shipper that submits to inspections to actually put things on passenger aircraft and ship them with a certification and following some chain of custody requirements. Again, if you're an operations manager, the way that you establish your layout is important, because that is how you can most effectively do it. So let me give you an example. If you're a manufacturer, you can do a certification and go through the CCSP because you have a good that requires responsive, quick shipping, so you need to use air. You get a certification to go through the program. However, you have to make some decisions in layout, both in how you optimize that it is established, and you make a cost-benefit analysis to figure out the number of people that will require security background checks to ensure that they can have unescorted access to that particular cargo. So those last point, the people that would be by themselves and at the last point be able to do something, introduce something, they have to be checked. So you can do one of 2 things. You can build it into the process because you have a relatively small number of people, make the entire facility secure so that you know that only the people that are there have access to do it, and it's relatively inexpensive. But in some manufacturing facilities where you've got 500 or 1,000 people, it likely doesn't make sense to spend the money on those annual recertifications. So what you do is you make a decision about where you take it out and apply those. So the effectiveness part of your compliance is good, but you sacrifice a little efficiency, but you have to make basically an ROI decision about when you would implement that. That optimization and the process improvement and how you combine those things, large changes, especially since September 11th, may assure you to be basically are designed to ensure that you've applied the appropriate amount of screening, but you also have control and a chain of custody that you can point to individuals that are experiencing any problems. One that I think that is most misunderstood by many people is the chemical and hazmat control requirements. That's done from the Department of Homeland Security in the new chemical facility anti-terrorism standards, and people would be surprised at what controls there are. For instance, there are certain, let's say you use ammonium nitrate in an agriculture setting. There's limits to how much you can store. Period. You can't store a certain amount of them of ammonium nitrate in the same place. And then when you do store a lower threshold of it, you have to have a very specific security plan assigned where you actually are inspected. So depending on where the threshold is, things like ammonium nitrate, things like above ground fuel tanks, petroleum, once you hit a certain threshold, you're required to have a security plan on how to deal with that. That, along with in the next one, the various personnel requirements, and not just international, depending on what you're doing, especially in CFATs, or if you're doing any kind of shipping that's in any of the certified programs, or hazardous material that could be used for a terrorist event, on rail, in trucking, on any, you have to go through personnel requirements. Most people don't know that if you have a truck driver that has a certain class, that will haul a certain class of hazardous materials, specifically almost all of the class of toxic inhalation hazards, they have to be certified and go through a TSA vetting process to ensure that they can carry those. And so now what you have really is you have to build a scheduling model to know who is certified and isn't, as you decide, as you make dispatching decisions, to know who can go and pick up a particular type of cargo. In the case of SEVIS, a Student Exchange Visitor Information Service, that primarily applies to training, but it also applies to other, even truck driving, depending on if you're asking for the Hazmat certification. But the bottom line is, regardless of what your line of business is, when you sponsor on what's called an I-20, you sponsor to hire an individual, there's reporting requirements, travel, there's records that you must keep to ensure that the individuals that you've sponsored in are doing what they're supposed to. For schools, they have to report whether or not the individuals show up. In manufacturing and others, if depending on the type of visa, you would have to report if they don't appear until their final is granted, but you sponsored them. There's reporting requirements. You have to say, yes, they got here. So you might find yourself in a situation in personnel and record keeping where you need an entire new process that you've designed it so that you've trained even down to the supervisor level. Very large corporations, someone could come in and it wouldn't be unusual that you could lose track of them because you've only got one person that understands the requirements. You have to go down to a lower level and actually provide a new set of training on reporting, records, and what the travel report requirements are. So when do you have to do it, and when did it start? I put some of the basic requirements that would affect operations managers. First, the Aviation Transportation Security Act. I think that's the one that people think of because it has to do with travel, all modes. It's what started screening with the Transportation Security Administration, and also it grants the authority to set the type of regulation that we reviewed. The Homeland Security Act that set up the separate department and took several different departments and aligned under that one secretary, reassigns many of those duties. But the thing I would like to point out too that's part of Homeland Security is FEMA and emergency response. Often what will happen is, as an example, when you establish your say you're a chemical, you have chemicals that you need for your manufacturing, or let's say that you have export control items. When you have an emergency, you actually have to certify in all of those in your plan that you're going to be compliant with National Incident Management System requirements, which is really a structure to establish how you manage an emergency situation. All of those programs require you to submit a plan to show that your individuals have been trained. So you're going to find where you have to train individuals in emergency response procedures. The average time it's about 20 hours of training. You can do it online through FEMA and take a test. But the point is, you have to do it, and then you have to actually exercise it to show that you have the ability to exercise if something was to occur, if you were to have an emergency situation happen. Again, scheduling, fitting that into how it works, organizing yourself in a way. even the way that you look at a strategic plan about whether or not you will or won't do, what the vision statement would be, everything is affected by those new requirements and decisions you would make. The Patriot Act is the other. First off, there's many more. I just highlighted these. But the Patriot Act requires some reporting requirements for different industries. It may require for you to provide information on individuals that are in your employ. It has some of the provisions expired, and after the sunset, they weren't reestablished, but some of those are grandfathered. So understanding what you have to do and not just what you have to do in the future, it may never happen to you, but you have to keep records. What many individuals and what managers will find is that when the time has come that they have to deliver something to the government, they've not maintained the appropriate record. They're required to keep the records and even not destroy them for a period of time, depending on what the sensitivity of the program is. This is kind of a partial list of I'd say the main rules or laws that you would see. And this is the important thing to understand. These are the laws. Each of the laws end up having or enacted around them anywhere from 3 to 10 regulations, which is really where the implementation requirement is. If you look here really quickly, you can see, depending on where you're located and how you ship items, you're not untouched anywhere as far as what you would have to do. The issue with the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act has to do specifically with how would you manage things. Some of you might remember that in Katrina that we had several industries that didn't have a good plan of how to deal with that emergency, that had sensitive materials, explosives, hazardous materials, and others. They have to comply with the plan about how they would do an orderly evacuation if they were to have an emergency. The bottom line is each of these will have some application that you have to understand. And I can't think of a single industry that has zero requirements in the post 9/11 world. I can think of several that may not think it applies to them, but I can't think of a single industry that doesn't have it apply to them in some shape, form, or fashion. Where touches about the things that we had said before. Obviously ports, that would be airports, marine ports, exchange locations for railroad, the different types of communication modes and elements, all lines of manufacturing that have any kind of and again, I can't think of a single one that doesn't. Shipping and supply chains, both again, effective, but also remaining their efficiency and how they will put several of those requirements together. And operational facilities everywhere that you go. HR has some very significant requirements depending on what type of business. Certainly everybody would understand if they're doing work for the Department of Defense. In most cases, they've got some, or the Department of Homeland Security. But often, some of the simplest things that you wouldn't think of, just because of the fact of what the transportation mode could be, would require you to do some very specific certifications. Businesses that most people would have no idea, blood banks, human organs, funeral homes even, have to go through a certification process so that they can submit it in different types of shipping facilities. They can submit those and certify them for both for transit, but also that they're safe to be put on a shelf. And then the last one I put, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not really, is at the feed store locally. Feed stores have ammonia nitrate. They have several different nitrate derivatives that could be explosives, and consequently, they're regulated. They're not only regulated in how much they can keep, they're regulated on reporting and recording everybody that purchases an amount over a threshold, and the threshold is pretty low. So they actually have to keep records of who they sold that to so that it can be looked at later. Obviously, that's not the major, but if you look at domestic terrorism, Timothy McVeigh and others, you can kind of understand what the concern would be. One for some very simple things that anybody would have to do in planning as far as layout and then moving is during a national special security event. If you had a business in or around Houston last week during the Super Bowl and it required you to move goods quickly, the fact of the matter is there was not going to be any of the things that you would imagine could come in and out at during the Super Bowl by air, and then several of the chemicals couldn't. So as an example, in the movement by rail, if you're looking for a location, it'd be very important to understand that in New York City, for example, that rail can't bring any of what they would call class 1 or any of the TIH hazards coming into what they refer to as the high threat urban area. So if you had a plant and it required, let's say, on propane or on ammonium nitrate, if it relied on things that other parts of the city would be able to bring in using rail and then transport it easily and close to you, what you'd find out very quickly is that your location isn't going to work well for your supplier, because all of your goods are going to have to be outside, and even the other side in New Jersey, and you're going to have to truck them in, and you have to break them in to smaller groups and units. Clearly, that's going to change your ability to both manufacture, to bring goods in, and to begin doing that work. So when you make a location strategy, you have to fully understand what the implications are for the supplies that you need to start with, and then understand also what you're going to have to do when you get to the point that you are producing something and it has to leave. More than one individual, I can tell you from when I was in the government, had come up with an idea to start a company, and then when they began to do the shipping, they had depended upon, their whole business model had been using rail for low-cost shipping, and then they discover, based on their location, they couldn't use rail. They were going to have to break them down into smaller, and it literally was the difference between making money and losing money, and there was nothing for them to do at that time. They had to go out of business because their planning didn't take into effect what was required. Identification access control into both for what you would budget, but also how you look at your ability to work in certain areas. You have to work unescorted in certain areas, such as a port, or in some cases there's a few airports on the cargo side that require it, but the transportation worker identification card requires you, whether it's rail, trucking, etc. So it wouldn't be unusual for you to have your truck driver, depending on where they deliver or pick up, for you to have to budget and know that you're going to have to do a TSA clearance and a Hazmat endorsement, and that you're also going to have to pay for them to have a transportation worker identification card so they can get in and out of those secure areas. Here's the number one thing I think that most don't understand, and why the government is so interested. But depending on the report, every year it changes a little bit. But of the high value critical infrastructure, so all the things you could think of that we want to make sure we protect against terrorist acts or against natural disasters or man-made disasters, at least it's never gone below 85%, I can recall, is privately owned. So it's private industry that owns and is responsible to protect most of the things that are considered critical, evaluated critical by the government. A few things I could tell you that are important, and even below that, when I say the government, I mean federal and state and local. So now you come down to, like, when you have a situation where a state is responsible, as an example, for things that are critical. There's some key bridges across the Mississippi River that if you were to lose those bridges, that in a short amount of time without an emergency response plan, the ability to have enough chlorine east of the Mississippi River to have safe, clean drinking water would begin to be in doubt within a week. So understanding the significance of some of the critical infrastructure and what it means is important. It's certainly important if you're considering what would happen if an emergency or another event, or even a natural disaster, if you've planned appropriately for secondary sources. All of this is not even speaking to what you really see occur for global. If you're a global company and decisions that you have to make, both shipping to and from, and what you have to consider about individuals that you employ, some of the decisions that you would make in other parts of the world, or the type of reciprocal agreements to hire individuals there, whether there's an agreement with that company about the percentage of principals that you must bring on board, that is a totally and different animal. You have to now make a decision about whether or not that type of work is really cost effective. And if you can look at do an ROI, you find out often that it's very difficult to justify the cost of where you would be trying to do it. Cybersecurity is a part of in all of industry. More and more and more, the certifications that are considered for requirement and to meet new standards, whether they are ANSI or ISO standards about the type of measures that go into effect, or whether they are required because of the specific type of industry that you're involved in. In some cases, you have to do some certifications at the enterprise level for the government to show that you in fact have secured it. So as an example, if you're in the rail industry, or if you're in the airline industry, the backbone of the vetting system that establishes whether someone can fly, or if they're a selectee or a no-fly or terrorist, the backbone of that system is built into the privately owned systems of the airlines, and then it has an interface with the government to do the checks. But you have to go through a cybersecurity system and certification at the enterprise level to show that in fact your system can't be compromised, so that what you're giving to the government is really the information that they should have to make a decision. The one that's becoming, I'd say, the hottest item now is the unmanned aircraft system. There's several industries now in supply chain and inventory management that are moving towards the use of drones, if you will, to improve effectiveness and to maintain some some inventory control or some supply chain looks. Yard management of trucks would be a good example. Already inside they're being used. But as those grow, one of the questions that's coming up, especially with what's been happening overseas, we see increasing threat from overseas, the use of drones, even small commercial drones, to be weaponized, to drop bombs, to just cause havoc in general. They're now slowly, there's decisions about the size, and it looks like there's going to be an impending rule that says if you're an industry using a drone and it exceeds the small UAS requirements below 55 pounds, then you're going to have to go through a certification process for airworthiness, which includes a cybersecurity process to show that it has some defenses against being hacked. Not that tough to hack them right now, honestly, though at the current SUAS level. In the end, all of this about how you comply with security and safety, and then your effectiveness of how you're going to put those together and optimize it. One of the examples I think that most people miss in shipping has to do with, as I was talking earlier, about the point that you do a search, or if it's required to do it at all. In some cases, the decision, for the first time I think in history, decisions are being made based on the security requirement instead of only the cost. If you're a just-in-time shipper, and that's the way that you look to do things, it is very likely that you're going to have to spend time figuring out what exactly I need to do to comply so that I can ship by air, or in some cases, especially with different types of hazardous material or something that meets in the CFET standards, what you're going to have to do. And then Who's going to monitor that and ensure that you've met those compliance, or you have remained compliant over the course of the process? The difficulty is never setting up these programs with the government and getting certified. Don't take me wrong, there's a lot to do. It's always about the maintenance of those, how you do continuous improvement and then quality control to ensure that you are building those in, and where you can take you can optimize by combining different processes and doing them in a way that you can keep the cost down, that you continue to look for those. And that means you have to monitor every time that the requirement changes, either gets better or worse depending on your view, and then you can adjust it. Okay, a little over 30 minutes for what would be, I think, several hours of at least more than just an overview of the kind of things that an operations manager would face in a Homeland Security, and the things that most of us, I believe, many, may not be aware of what the requirements are. With that said, time for questions. If anybody has a question about any of these specific ones they'd like for me to address, if I can, I will. If I don't know, I'll get back to you certainly, but any questions anybody has, certainly open at this time, or if there's any that came by email. Well, while we're waiting, and anybody can either email to the address that was sent out previously, or you can send the questions in the chat box. I certainly can look at those to see if there's questions about any of those programs you've had. Let me talk a moment about the program and the future and some things that we have done. One of the things that we've tried our very best to do, especially in the last few years, is to listen to the type of things that individuals would want. And that's why you will see Organizing for Change, or an update of different courses to stay current with the skills that you're required to do. Homeland Security is one. It's a skill that you're going to have some involvement requirements. Unmanned aircraft systems, the requirements for that, and what we're seeing emerge in both supply chain and then some other elements. So this is the link to look, but if you're not in the program and you're interested, certainly you can get a lot of good information there, along with our site coordinators that could help you in the points of contact. And in a continuing effort to show exactly how effective we believe that some of the webinars and the feedback we've had, we have some coming up. Professor Nethercutt's going to talk about project management. Many of you may or may not be aware that we have a certificate to roll out, a graduate certificate. We're following much of what's in the PMBOK for certification, and then you get some real practical experience. And then Professor Nethercutt's going to talk about project management, how to position yourself career-wise and looking towards certification. And then in April, Kirk Michelson is going to speak to us, an expert absolutely on time management and looking at what that can do for you. Every operations manager, I can all but guarantee you anecdotally, and supply and research shows it as well, if you ask them the #1 issue that they have, they're going to talk about how they manage their time with the way that they're pulled in several different directions. So, all right, are there any questions that we have? Okay, here's the one. If everybody can see it in the chat box, the box. Absolutely. So it's a great question, Greg. So what they have to do, both in a CTPAT certification, depending upon the size and the danger, and there's actually a risk matrix they run. They have to go down to second and sometimes tertiary supplier levels to certify those, unless they have intervening security, either screening or other events that occur between now and then. So great question. You can be not even involved. You can be a secondary or tertiary supplier, and the survey will drill all the way to you to look at what your different certifications, including industry certifications, ISO certifications, etc., to see if your processes are actually ensuring that you're shipping out the correct thing. That's a great question. I'd make a plug as anybody's thinking about something they would ask for, especially for ISO. ANSI's got some that actually can be used as a what they call an alternative mean of compliance, where you can show in certain, as long as you complete the background checks, you can show that your quality process meets either an ANSI or meets an ISO standard primarily. There's some ANSI standards that actually back into that and can be used. And if you show that you're compliant and that you will follow those, it makes your security plan that you submit much easier. Okay, we'll give just a minute for anybody that's got another question. While anybody, if they're thinking about a question, look, I would bring a couple of things that are important, I think, that are current events to consider on the HR side. Clearly there were several industries that planned for. They made plans in their HR, in their strategic plan for HR. They made plans to use certain high school workers from around the world. And you can see the implications of this when you see Google and Microsoft and what their reactions are to the recent executive orders and what it meant to them. So the thing I would say that is important to look in HR policies is that when you make a strategic plan there, you also have to follow what is your plan. Just like that you would have to follow suppliers, what's your plan if you don't have access to those individuals? If something happens where it slows down or you can't have them immediately, what will you do? Will you move some of it to other parts of the world? Will you be able to replace those workers? But having a plan in advance about how you'll deal with it, as opposed to trying to figure out that, I've got all my eggs in one basket. That's an important HR strategy to figure out what do you do if those types of situations occurred. For many of them, of the companies, and higher ed included, there's a significant impact that has to be addressed and figure out what to do as the final policy is working its way through. If you're not thinking of that strategically, then you're going to find yourself definitely behind the 8 ball when something happens. And it can change in every direction, not just with elections, but also with different appointees in government, and also just from events. Every terrorist event that happens overseas inevitably leads to more regulation, and something will change. And so as you look at things like trucks being used to drive into markets, you can all but guarantee that there's going to be new requirements happening at different types of high risk or infrastructure for them to certify that they can withstand something of that magnitude. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions. Certainly, you can see Ashley has posted our Facebook, and certainly if you have any questions on this or other topics, feel free to email or send a question, and we will send it back to the best of our knowledge and help you to figure out or how to navigate some of these things. It's a new, I would say relatively new, within the last 15 years or so, new challenge and consideration.
Rich, Randy's posted another question.
Okay, so great question by Professor Roy, about Homeland Security operation opportunities for the expansion of border drones. There is a movement in several industries now for the added utility of drones. In fact, they just started a new test at an airport, at Atlanta Airport, on a remote side, to use drones to do some of the standard things you would expect that you would use personnel to use. Things like perimeter security, looking for wildlife because you can mount infrared, and others. So on the border in particular, there's a great a large growth. In fact, there's several of them that are being purchased as we speak that are going to be used to increase the presence. There's already a presence there, but the presence with improved requirements, plus the improvement of or the increase in the number of qualified individuals coming out of the military. You know, individuals that have experience with large platforms like the Predator and others, not you know, just commercially available DJI Phantoms or Inspires or 3DRs. We're talking about individuals that have experience with large, relatively fast movers, platforms with hyperspectral sensors that can be looking for everything from faces with some recognition software and others. So the opportunities on the border and the opportunities in industry to protect some assets is much. I'll give you an example of one that the railroads are doing now. There's a requirement for them to assess and monitor when they transfer some of these toxic inhalation hazards, depending on what standard they are. They've begun to use drones for the monitoring so that when the train stops in a remote location, rural, maybe 100 miles from the closest large area, then they are asking for a waiver for the drone to monitor it all the time, as opposed to having to put up fixed video everywhere, to monitor that from the system as long as they can show that they can respond if something was to occur. The same thing for some search and rescue and others. So we're seeing a great growth in how industry is starting to use them to reduce their cost, improve both their maintain their effectiveness, just as effective or more effective, but then improve their efficiency because they can lower cost as opposed to having to have 2 or 3 individuals sit there for 8 to 10 hours while they're waiting for a transfer to occur. It's a great question. There's a lot of places where you're going to see drones within 5 years replacing and really reducing the cost of a lot of the requirements. Extended to that are even ground-based systems, trucking and others, that what happens is, what changes is there's going to be a great difference in the number of individuals that you have that are required to have a background check. You're going to have an enterprise solution to show that you have, in fact, certified that you can't be hacked, but you don't have to do as many checks on truck drivers, etc. So going to change, going to become both effective and more efficient. The next one I see is I'm noticing a trend in private industries using NIMS and ICS training. Is it becoming a requirement for some industries? And yes, there's a great improvement, mostly because the way that the government typically does things, and that is to say, if you build the plan, you can build your own, but hint, hint, if you follow NIMS ICS principles, then you'll see it get approved very quickly. And oh, by the way, we'll provide the training free. You don't have to develop your own. And if you want to get this funding for cameras to protect a system or to protect a rail yard or others, then you get basically you're treated much better. It's much easier to get the approval. So no doubt about it that NIMS is going to get into and it is in the infrastructure requirements, but it's going to become more and more. It's already been that way at airports for almost 10 years, a requirement for the required FAA emergency plan to have NIMS ICS put there in case they have a crash or other events that they would do. So it's been that way, and other industries are heading the same direction. The next one about course available. We, in fact, here at the university, we just piloted a course to, in fact, we're in the middle of it now. It will also be available this year online, and it will talk about not just the requirements of what we would say, what's referred to as 14 CFR Part 107 to be certified as a remote pilot, but also other ways that you could comply and how you would use it in a way that would be effective, safe, and you're in compliance. We're teaching that course now, and it'll be available online in the future. So. Okay. Kind of down to the going once, going twice. Thank you for coming today. I'd remind you again of upcoming webinars and the information that we had showed of all of the different types of things that you could look at, both at the program, but also, we would ask for you, regardless of whether you take a course, you certainly can look at us as a resource in some of these areas. If you've got a Homeland Security question about how, for an operations manager, hey, you have any ideas? Do you know somebody, how they solve this problem? We certainly would do that, and we would be glad at any time to help you and become a resource for you. Otherwise, thank you for attending today. We hope that you, in fact, can make it to the next seminars, and if you need any information, please let us know. Thank you.